Millionaire, left his pregnant wife with twins. 4 years later, he saw his children at a charity. He had everything: money, power, a Park Avenue penthouse. But when Michael Cavendish walked out on his pregnant wife, Lena, he never imagined he'd see the consequences of that choice reflected in 2 small faces at a children's charity event 4 years later. They had his eyes. His exact eyes. What unfolded next was not just a story of regret and redemption. It was a storm of secrets, ambition, betrayal, and ultimately, love. If you think you've heard stories of second chances, think again. This one might just break your heart and put it back together again. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see this community come together. If you enjoy powerful stories, subscribe and hit the bell. Now, let's dive in. The air in the Manhattan penthouse was like the view, clear, cold, and worth a fortune. It was the kind of air that smelled of nothing but success, filtered and conditioned to a perfect 72 degrees. Michael Cavendish, all of 29 years old, breathed it in like a drug. His reflection stared back at him from the floor-to-ceiling window that framed the glittering, indifferent skyline of New York City. He wasn't just looking at himself. He was looking at the man Forbes had just canonized in their 30 Under 30 issue, the co-founder of Neurotech, a company poised to revolutionize human-computer interfaces. The headline, "The Architect of Tomorrow," was still ringing in his ears. He ran a hand through his meticulously styled dark hair, the weight of a custom-tailored Tom Ford suit resting on his shoulders. Everything in his life was custom-tailored: his suits, his schedule, his future. And the architect of that future, more so than himself, was Evelyn Harrington. The chime of his phone was crisp and demanding. It was Evelyn. "The Tokyo Consortium is in," she said, her voice devoid of pleasantries. It was a scalpel, designed to cut straight to the point. 100 million, Series C. The valuation is triple what we projected. Michael's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird in a gilded cage. "Evelyn, that's monumental." "It is," she agreed, a rare sliver of something almost like warmth in her tone. "But they're not just investing in the tech, Michael. They're investing in the narrative, the brilliant, unencumbered young visionary. They want a clean image, no baggage, no distractions." He knew what she meant. Evelyn, his mentor, and the primary investor who had plucked him from obscurity, had always preached a gospel of ruthless focus. Love, family, attachments, they were liabilities in the ledger of ambition. She was a woman carved from ice and stock options, and she was the reason he was standing in this penthouse instead of coding in a cramped apartment. "I understand," he said, his gaze drifting to the door of the art studio he'd had built for his wife in a corner of the sprawling apartment. "No distractions." "Good. I'll send the preliminary paperwork. Don't be late for the press dinner tonight." The line went dead. Michael slid the phone onto the marble countertop and walked towards the studio. The faint, familiar scent of turpentine and linseed oil met him at the door, a scent that was once his comfort, his anchor to a world outside of algorithms and boardrooms. It was the scent of Lena. Lena Rivera Cavendish. A name that felt like a poem in his mouth, a splash of vibrant color in his monochromatic world. She was a brilliant artist from Brooklyn, a woman whose talent burned with a ferocity that both captivated and unnerved him. He'd met her at a gallery opening where her work, bold, emotional, chaotic canvases, had been relegated to a back wall, overshadowed by more commercial pieces. He saw the genius she possessed, even if the world hadn't yet. He'd pursued her with the same single-minded intensity he applied to his business, promising her the world. And for a time, he had given it to her. He pushed the door open. Lena was standing in the center of the room, not painting. Her back was to him, her hands clasped behind her. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing around her like tiny lost stars. She looked small against the backdrop of a massive, unfinished canvas. "Lena," he said softly. She turned, and the breath caught in his throat. Her face, usually a landscape of expressive features, was pale and etched with a fragile, terrifying joy. Her dark, curly hair was pulled back, emphasizing the deep, soulful brown eyes that had first captured him. But it was her smile that stopped him. It was wide, trembling, and aimed directly at him. "Michael," she breathed, her voice thick with emotion. She took a step towards him, her hands moving from behind her back to rest protectively over her stomach. "We did it." He blinked, confused. "Did what? Did you sell a piece?" Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second, before roaring back to life. "No, something better. The doctor called an hour ago." She paused, savoring the moment, letting the tension build into a crescendo of pure happiness. "Michael, I'm pregnant." The words hit him like a physical blow. Pregnant. It was a word they had chased for 2 agonizing years, a word whispered in hushed tones after every negative test, a word that had become synonymous with failure and heartache. They had been told it was unlikely, a near impossibility. And now, a slow smile spread across his face, a genuine, uncalculated reaction that felt foreign. You're sure?" "I'm sure," she whispered, tears finally breaking free and tracing paths down her cheeks. The fertility treatments, the last round, it worked. He rushed forward, sweeping her into his arms and lifting her off the ground. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the scent of her, the scent of home. For a single, perfect moment, the Tokyo Consortium, the Series C funding, the Forbes article, it all dissolved into meaningless noise. This was real. This was life. He set her down gently, his hands tracing the curve of her waist, trying to imagine the new life blooming within. "A baby," he murmured, the word feeling clumsy and miraculous on his tongue. Lena's expression shifted, the joy deepening into something more profound, more awesome. "Not just a baby, my love." She took his hand and placed it flat against her still flat abdomen. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, filled with wonder. "Michael, it's twins." Twins! The word echoed in the vast, silent space of the penthouse. It wasn't a word of joy. It was an alarm bell. It was the sound of a carefully constructed future shattering into 1,000,000 pieces. Twins. Not one distraction, but 2. Not a quiet addition to his narrative, but a chaotic, demanding, all-consuming plot twist. The image of Evelyn's face flashed in his mind, her words sharp and clear. No baggage, no distractions. He felt the blood drain from his face. The genuine smile he'd worn just moments ago felt like a mask that was now cracking. He slowly pulled his hand away from Lena's stomach, as if it were burning him. Lena saw the shift instantly. Her own smile faltered, the light in her eyes dimming. "Michael, what is it?" He couldn't look at her. He turned away, walking back towards the window, towards the view of the empire he was building. The city lights were beginning to flicker on, a galaxy of ambition that he was so close to conquering. "Michael, talk to me," she pleaded, her voice losing its joyful lilt and taking on a familiar edge of anxiety. "The timing," he began, his voice a low rasp. "Lena, the timing is just... it's not good." "Not good?" She let out a laugh that was half sob, half disbelief. "We've been praying for this for years. We went through hell for this. How can it be not good?" He turned to face her, his expression hardening into a mask of cold logic, the face he wore in the boardroom. I just closed the biggest funding round of my career. The investors, they expect a certain commitment, my undivided attention. And you think being a father is a distraction? She asked, her voice rising. You think our children are a distraction? It's not that simple, he shot back, the pressure building in his chest. This is a critical phase. It's the launch. It's the IPO in 2 years. It's everything we've worked for. You've worked for, she corrected, her voice now dangerously quiet. I've been here, supporting you, putting my own career on hold, creating a home for you to come back to when you're done changing the world. I've been building a life, Michael. I thought we were building it together. Her words were arrows, each one finding its mark in the hollow space where his conscience used to be. He knew she was right. But Evelyn's voice was louder, a siren song of success that drowned out everything else. Unencumbered. Clean image. Lena, I can't do this right now, he said, the words tasting like ash. The color drained from her face, leaving her stark white. Can't do what? Can't do what, Michael? Be a father? Be my husband? He ran a hand over his face, the weight of his decision crushing him. He was standing at a precipice. On one side was the life he had, the cold, clear air of success. On the other was a messy, unpredictable, beautiful life with Lena and their children. He saw 2 paths, and in his moment of supreme weakness, he chose the one that led up, not the one that led home. I think, he started, his voice cracking. I think I need some space. I need to focus. Lena stared at him, her eyes wide with a dawning horror. It was a look of such profound betrayal that it would be seared into his memory for years, a ghost that would haunt him in his quietest, most successful moments. No, she whispered, shaking her head in denial. No, you don't mean that. You're just scared. We can do this. I'll handle everything. It won't affect your work, I promise. She was begging now, her pride dissolving in a desperate attempt to hold their world together. Michael, please, don't do this to me. Don't do this to them. Her hand went to her stomach, a gesture of pure, primal protection. It was that gesture that broke him, that solidified his terrible resolve. He couldn't look at her, at the future she was holding. He was a coward, and he chose the coward's way out. He walked to the bedroom, pulled a suitcase from the cavernous walk-in closet, and began mechanically packing. Shirts, suits, the symbols of his chosen life. He could feel her presence in the doorway, watching him, her silence a roaring condemnation. When he was done, he walked past her without a word, heading for the front door. Michael? Her voice was a raw scream of pain. He stopped, his hand on the cool metal of the doorknob, his back to her. If you walk out that door, she said, her voice trembling but gaining a sliver of steel, don't ever come back. You won't just be leaving me. You will be leaving your children. You will be a ghost to them. Do you understand? He understood. He understood the enormity of what he was doing. And yet, he couldn't stop himself. The allure of the narrative, the brilliant, unencumbered visionary, was too strong. He pulled the door open. I'm sorry, Lena, he whispered to the empty hallway. He stepped out and pulled the door closed. The final soft click echoed in the hallway, a sound of absolute finality. Inside, the silence of the penthouse descended upon Lena. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket. Her legs gave out from under her, and she crumpled to the polished marble floor. She wrapped her arms tightly around her stomach, a silent promise to the 2 lives nestled within her. The scream that had been building in her chest finally erupted, but it was soundless, a violent, tearing agony that ripped through her soul. In the vast, opulent emptiness of the home they had built, the silence was louder and more terrifying than any noise could ever be. She was utterly and completely alone. Part 2. The Disappearance. The Manhattan penthouse was a universe away. Lena's new world was a third-floor walk-up in Astoria, Queens, the neighborhood where she had grown up, a place that smelled of roasted street nuts, exhaust fumes, and her mother's arroz con gandules. The rejection and public humiliation were a cloak she wore, heavy and suffocating. News of their separation had been a brief, salacious item in the gossip columns, a footnote in the epic of Michael Cavendish's ascent. Tech mogul splits from artist wife, the headlines read, painting her as a casualty of his ambition. They were right. She moved back into her family's orbit, a constellation of loud, loving, and fiercely protective aunts, uncles, and cousins who buffered her from the sharpest edges of her pain. They never spoke of Michael. To them, he was a name that had been erased from their history. Her pregnancy was difficult, marked by morning sickness that lasted all day and a profound, bone-deep exhaustion that had as much to do with her broken heart as it did with the 2 lives she was growing. There were nights she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, one hand on her burgeoning belly, feeling the flutter of 2 distinct movements, a tiny foot here, a hiccup there. In those moments, the loneliness was a physical presence in the room. She gave birth in the middle of a sweltering July heat wave to 2 beautiful, tiny girls. The first, Sophia, came into the world with a loud, indignant cry, her eyes wide open, taking in everything. She had Lena's dark, curly hair and her fiery spirit. The second, Luna, arrived 5 minutes later, silent and serene. She was a mirror image of her sister, but her eyes, a startling shade of crystalline blue, were all Michael's. From the moment she was born, Luna was different. She rarely cried. She watched the world with a calm, unnerving intensity, as if she were processing it on a level no one else could understand. Lena's art had been her voice, but now it became her salvation. The pain of Michael's betrayal was a raw, gaping wound. Instead of letting it fester, she poured it onto canvas. But these weren't the pieces she would sell. These were for her. They were dark, chaotic, and filled with a grief so palpable it seemed to bleed from the paint. When the girls were 6 months old, the money she'd saved from the few paintings she'd sold before Michael was running low. Humility was a lesson she was learning daily. She found a job, not in a chic Soho gallery, but as an art therapist at a small, struggling nonprofit in her neighborhood called Hands of Hope. The center catered to underprivileged and disabled children, offering them a sanctuary where they could express themselves through art. It was there, surrounded by the vibrant, messy, and uninhibited creativity of these children, that Lena began to heal. She saw how a splash of yellow paint could bring a smile to the face of a child who had seen too much darkness. She saw how molding clay could give a sense of control to a child whose life was anything but. She was good at it. She was brilliant. She found a purpose that had nothing to do with gallery openings or critical acclaim. Her life became a quiet routine of motherhood and work. Mornings were a whirlwind of diapers, bottles, and coaxing Sophia to eat her strained peas. Days were spent at Hands of Hope, her own daughters often playing in a quiet corner of the studio. Evenings were for them. She would read them stories, her voice soft, creating a world for them free of ghosts. Sometimes, she would sit in the small nursery she had painted herself. The walls were a soft, sunny yellow. On one wall, she had painted a sprawling tree with 2 little birds nestled in its branches. She would hold up the 2 tiny dresses she had bought when she first found out she was having girls, one pink, one blue. She'd press them to her face, the fabric still smelling of the department store, and whisper to her sleeping daughters. "I'm so sorry," she would say, tears tracking silently down her face. "I'm sorry for the father you'll never know, but I promise you, you will always be loved." You will always be enough. Meanwhile, across the river, Michael Cavendish skyrocketed. Neuratech's IPO was a phenomenal success, making him a billionaire before his 30th birthday. He was no longer just in Forbes, he was on the cover of Time, Wired, The Wall Street Journal. His life was a blur of private jets, keynote speeches in Tokyo and Berlin, and a rotating cast of supermodels and actresses on his arm. He became a tabloid favorite, his face splashed across magazines at the checkout counter, a symbol of a new generation of untouchable tech royalty. He built a fortress around his heart. He told himself that Lena, resilient and strong, had moved on. He convinced himself that maybe, just maybe, the stress of the breakup had... He could never finish the thought. The idea that she had lost the baby was a convenient, monstrous lie he allowed himself to believe because the alternative was too painful to confront. He never reached out. He never asked. It was easier to believe she had disappeared, that chapter of his life was simply over. The guilt was a low hum beneath the roar of his success, a frequency he could ignore as long as he kept moving, as long as he kept climbing. He was the architect of tomorrow, and tomorrow had no room for yesterday's mistakes. He was rich, powerful, and admired by the world, and he had never been more alone. 4 years passed like this. 4 years of building an empire on a foundation of regret. 4 years of Lena rebuilding a life from the ashes of his betrayal. 4 years of Sophia growing into a bright, chatty, inquisitive little girl. And Luna, her silent, watchful shadow, who had yet to speak a single word. The doctors had a name for Luna's quiet world: autism spectrum disorder. For Lena, it was just Luna, her beautiful, mysterious, perfect daughter. The two girls were her entire universe, a world Michael Cavendish had no idea even existed. Part 3. The Reunion. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was a sea of glittering diamonds and tailored tuxedos. Crystal chandeliers dripped light onto tables laden with floral arrangements and ridiculously small appetizers. The air was thick with the murmur of polite, powerful conversation, the language of money, influence, and performative philanthropy. This was the annual fundraising gala for the Hands of Hope Children's Foundation, an event that had, through sheer force of will from its new board members, become a staple on the Manhattan charity circuit. Michael Cavendish stood near the bar, a glass of champagne in his hand that he had no intention of drinking. He felt a familiar sense of detachment, the same ennui that accompanied him to every one of these functions. They were obligations, strategic appearances. This one was Evelyn's pet project. Now his full business partner and COO of Neuratech, Evelyn had taken a sudden interest in philanthropy, specifically this small, upstart foundation from Queens. It was good for the brand, she'd said. Corporate responsibility with a human touch. "Mingle, Michael," Evelyn hissed, appearing at his side like a phantom in a silver Carolina Herrera gown. Her smile was a slash of red lipstick, tight and predatory. "You look like you're waiting for a bus. The mayor is over by the silent auction. Go look interested." "I'm donating $1 million, Evelyn," Michael said, his voice flat. "I think that shows sufficient interest." "Donating is easy," she countered, her eyes scanning the room. "Presence is power. Go." He sighed, handing his untouched champagne to a passing waiter. He made his way through the throng of people, nodding, smiling, shaking hands, his public persona clicking into place like armor. He drifted towards the art wall, a large display set up to showcase the work of the children from the Hands of Hope Center. It was a chaotic explosion of color: finger paintings, clay sculptures, and crayon drawings. It was supposed to be the heart of the event, a reminder of the cause, but most of the guests flowed past it, more interested in the open bar. And then he saw them. They were sitting on a small bench in front of the wall, away from the main crowd, Two little girls who were the spitting image of each other. They each had a large sketch pad on their laps and were drawing with intense concentration. They couldn't have been more than 4 years old. They both had wild, dark curls tied back with matching blue ribbons. They wore identical navy blue velvet dresses. One girl was chattering away to the other, pointing at her drawing. The other was silent, her focus absolute, her small hand moving a crayon across the paper with deliberate strokes. Michael stopped. It wasn't just their identical appearance that held him captive. It was something in their faces, a familiarity that struck him like a physical blow. He moved closer, a strange magnetic pull drawing him in. The chattering girl looked up, her train of thought interrupted by his shadow falling over her. She smiled, a bright, gap-toothed grin. "Hi," she said, and then he saw it. In the quiet girl, who lifted her head a moment later. Her eyes. They were his eyes. The same crystalline blue, a shade so distinct it had been a defining feature his entire life. They were looking at him from the face of this tiny, silent child. The world tilted on its axis. The polite chatter of the gala. The clinking of glasses. The soft music. It all faded into a roaring silence. He could hear nothing but the frantic, panicked drumming of his own heart. It couldn't be. It was impossible. A lie he had told himself for 4 years, shattered in an instant. She moved on. Maybe she lost the baby. He sank to his haunches, his expensive suit creasing, his mind struggling to process the information his eyes were feeding him. "Hello," he managed to say, his voice a hoarse whisper. "What are your names?" The talkative one puffed out her chest proudly. "I'm Sophia, and this is my sister Luna." She pointed to the silent girl who just watched him, her blue eyes wide and unblinking. Sophia and Luna. The names felt like ghosts on his tongue. He had never heard them before, yet they felt like a part of him. "Those are beautiful drawings," he said, his gaze fixed on Luna. Her drawing was a series of intricate, swirling patterns, all in shades of blue. His eyes. "Thank you," a voice said from behind him, a voice that froze the blood in his veins. Time stopped. He had heard that voice in his dreams, in his nightmares, in the quiet moments of regret he so fiercely denied. He rose slowly, turning as if in a trance. And there she was, Lina Rivera. She was different, yet entirely the same. The years had sharpened the soft lines of her face, giving her a new, formidable elegance. She wore a simple, dark green dress that highlighted the strength in her shoulders and the grace in her posture. Her hair was pulled back, and her eyes, those deep, soulful brown eyes, held a universe of emotions he couldn't begin to decipher. There was pain, yes, but there was also a steely resilience, a poise that unnerved him. The storm he saw in her eyes was contained, controlled, making it all the more terrifying. "Lina," he breathed. The name was an admission, a confession, a prayer. Her expression didn't change. There was no shock, no outburst, just a cool, level acknowledgement. "Michael, I wondered if I'd see you here, publicly cornered." His mind reeled. The people, the noise, it all came rushing back. He was Michael Cavendish, the tech visionary. He was supposed to be in control. But he was stumbling, drowning in the flood of a past he had tried to bury. "These are," he started, his voice cracking as he gestured helplessly towards the girls. "My daughters," Lina finished for him, her voice calm and even. She walked to the girls, placing a protective hand on each of their shoulders. Sophia immediately leaned into her. Luna remained focused on him, her gaze unwavering. "They have my eyes," he whispered, the words a statement of impossible fact. Lina's chin lifted a fraction of an inch. "They get that from their father." The words were a quiet, devastating blow, delivered with surgical precision. She wasn't yelling, she wasn't crying. She was stating a fact. and the coldness of it was worse than any rage. He needed to get her away from the crowd. Can we talk? Somewhere private?" She considered him for a moment before giving a single, sharp nod. She whispered something to Sophia, who then took Luna's hand. An older woman with a kind face, Lena's mother, he vaguely recognized, appeared and led the girls away. Lena led him to a small, deserted balcony overlooking the dark expanse of Central Park. The cool night air did nothing to calm the fire in his veins. As soon as they were alone, his composure shattered. "They're mine," he said, the words raw, accusatory. "They're my daughters. Why didn't you tell me? Why did you disappear?" Lena finally let a sliver of the storm show. A bitter, mirthless smile touched her lips. "Tell you? I seem to recall the last time I told you something. You walked out the door. You made your choice, Michael. You chose the clean narrative, the unencumbered life. This," she gestured vaguely back towards the ballroom, "is my life. You don't get to be a part of it." "I have a right," he insisted, his voice rising with desperation. "I have a right to know my children." "You lost that right the day you walked away from them," she shot back, her voice still low but now laced with steel. "You don't have rights, Michael. You have opportunities, and you threw yours away. For 4 years, I have been their mother and their father. I have stayed up with them through fevers. I have kissed their scraped knees. I have held them when they had nightmares. I painted a nursery alone. I celebrated their first birthdays alone. Where were you? You were on the cover of magazines. You don't get to swoop in now at a charity gala and demand a place in their lives because you're feeling a pang of guilt." Every word was a nail in his coffin. He had no defense. He knew she was right. He sagged against the railing, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a hollow, aching cavern of regret. "Lena, I didn't know. I thought—" "What did you think?" she asked, her voice genuinely curious now. "That I just vanished? That the pregnancy just vanished? It was easier for you that way, wasn't it? To not ask, to not know, to tell yourself whatever story you needed to so you could sleep at night in your penthouse." He couldn't answer. He could only stare at her, at the woman he had wronged so profoundly. For the first time in 4 years, a feeling washed over him that was deeper and more real than the fleeting high of a successful IPO or the adrenaline of a new deal. It wasn't just guilt. It was a regret so profound it felt like a physical illness, a cancer in his soul. He had not just made a mistake. He had committed a sin against the only thing that had ever truly mattered. As he stood there, stripped bare by her words and his own crushing realization, Evelyn walked out onto the balcony, her silver dress shimmering. "Everything all right?" she asked, her gaze flicking between Michael's shattered expression and Lena's rigid composure. She looked at Lena, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "Ms. Rivera, I'm Evelyn Harrington. I'm a great admirer of your foundation's work." Lena's focus shifted to Evelyn, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Thank you, Miss Harrington. Your support is greatly appreciated. In fact, it's crucial." "Crucial?" Michael asked, latching onto the word, desperate for a way to fix this, to do something. Lena looked back at him, her expression unreadable. "Hands of Hope is about to lose its lease. We've been operating on a shoestring budget for years. Your generous donation tonight is a lifeline, but it's a temporary one. We need a permanent solution, a long-term benefactor, or we'll have to close our doors in 6 months." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. A cruel twist of fate. The charity he was here to support, the one Evelyn had chosen for its PR value, was Lena's life's work. It was at risk of disappearing. And he, the man who had destroyed her life, was the only one with the power to save it. He had the money. He had the influence. He could write a check and solve her problem. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was a debt that could never be repaid with money. Part 4. Redemption and Secrets. The power to save hands of hope sat in his bank account, a string of meaningless numbers. But writing a check felt like a continuation of the same mistake he'd always made, trying to solve a human problem with money. It was an insult to what Lena had built, a hollow gesture. He needed to understand. He needed to earn his way back, not buy it. The following Monday, a man named Mike showed up to volunteer at the Hands of Hope Center in Queens. He wore jeans, a plain gray t-shirt, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He told the harried volunteer coordinator he was new to the neighborhood and had some free time. No one recognized the billionaire from the cover of Time magazine. No one except Lena. She saw him the moment he walked in, her heart lurching into her throat. She watched from the doorway of her small office as he was handed a bucket and a mop and pointed towards a paint-spattered floor. She expected him to balk, to make an excuse and leave. He didn't. He just nodded and started mopping, his movements awkward at first, then settling into a steady rhythm. She decided to let the charade play out. Let him see what this world was really like, far from the galas and boardrooms. Let him scrub the floors and clean the paintbrushes and see the leaky pipes in the ceiling. Michael, or Mike, threw himself into the work. He unclogged toilets, fixed broken easels, and organized the chaotic art supply closet. He listened more than he spoke, observing the controlled chaos of the center. He saw the worn-out furniture, the second-hand supplies, the look of exhaustion and fierce dedication on the faces of the staff. And he saw the children. He saw their unvarnished joy, their struggles, their resilience. This place was more than a charity. It was a sanctuary. It was a home. He kept his distance from the twins, terrified of overwhelming them. He watched them from afar. Sophia was a social butterfly, flitting from group to group, her laughter echoing through the halls. Luna was her own quiet island. She would sit in a corner of the main art room, her sketchbook her only companion, her blue eyes taking in everything. She didn't speak, not to the other children, not to the teachers, not even to Sophia. She communicated through her drawings, intricate worlds of color and shape. One afternoon, Michael was tasked with cleaning the art room. Luna was there, sitting at her usual small table. The other children had gone outside to play. He moved quietly, wiping down tables, his gaze continually drifting back to her. He noticed a box of brand-new, high-quality pastels sitting on a high shelf, still in their plastic wrap, a luxury in this place of meager resources. He took them down and approached her table hesitantly. He didn't say a word. He simply opened the box and placed it beside her sketchbook. Her eyes, those startlingly familiar blue eyes, flicked from the pastels to his face. There was no fear, just a quiet curiosity. He pulled up a small chair, took out a spare piece of paper, and picked up a piece of charcoal. He began to draw, not looking at her, just sketching the patterns of light coming through the dusty window. After a few minutes, he felt a small movement beside him. Luna had picked up a deep blue pastel. She didn't look at him, but on her own page, she began to draw. They sat there for nearly an hour, side by side in companionable silence, communicating not with words, but with color and line. He drew the world outside the window. She drew the world inside her head. In that silence, he felt a connection purer and more profound than any conversation he'd ever had. It was the first time he felt like a father. Lena watched the entire exchange from the doorway of her office, her arms crossed over her chest. A war raged within her. The part of her that had been so deeply wounded screamed that this was a trick, a performance. But the part of her that was a mother The part that saw the quiet, patient man sitting with her silent daughter felt the ice around her heart begin to crack. He wasn't trying to force a connection. He was meeting Luna in her world, on her terms. His resolve softening, she found herself re-examining the past. She thought about his cowardice, his weakness. It was inexcusable, but was it entirely his own? The name that kept surfacing in her mind was Evelyn Harrington. A few days later, driven by a new, burning curiosity, Lena found herself in the main office, digging through old financial records. Hands of Hope had nearly closed its doors 3 years ago before an anonymous donation had appeared, enough to cover the rent for a full year. The wire transfer was from a shell corporation, but the contact email listed was for a personal assistant. On a hunch, Lena looked up the name. The assistant worked for a private art broker, one of the most exclusive in the city. Lena's blood ran cold. She went home that night and pulled a dusty portfolio from the back of her closet. Inside was the documentation for a single painting she had sold 3.5 years ago. It was a massive, fiery canvas she had painted in the depths of her despair, a piece she considered her masterpiece. Desperate for money to keep the center afloat, she had sold it through a broker under a pseudonym she'd used in college, L. Rivera. The sale had been anonymous, the buyer unknown. The amount was exactly what the charity had received. The buyer hadn't been a random art lover. The buyer had been Michael's company, or more specifically, Evelyn's. She hadn't just known about the charity, she had known about Lena's personal sacrifice. The next day, Lena walked into the gleaming, sterile lobby of Neuratech headquarters in Manhattan. She didn't have an appointment, but she radiated an authority that receptionists were not trained to question. She was on Evelyn Harrington's floor in minutes. Evelyn was sitting behind a vast desk of glass and steel, the city glittering behind her. She didn't look surprised to see Lena. "Miss Rivera," Evelyn said, her voice smooth as silk. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "Cut the act, Evelyn," Lena said, her voice low and steady. "You bought my painting 3 years ago. You knew I was using the money to save the charity." Evelyn leaned back, a small, knowing smile on her face. "It was a brilliant piece, an excellent investment. And you knew about the twins," Lena continued, her voice gaining strength. "All along, didn't you?" The smile didn't falter. "Michael receives hundreds of pieces of correspondence a week. Personal matters are filtered by my office. It's a matter of efficiency." The world seemed to slow down. "Filtered?" Lena repeated, her heart pounding. "I wrote to him, after the girls were born. I sent pictures. I told him their names. I told him I was scared, and I needed him." The confession was ripped from her, a secret shame she had buried for years. She had swallowed her pride and reached out, and had been met with nothing but silence. "As I said," Evelyn replied coolly, "distractions are bad for business. Michael was on the verge of greatness. He needed to be focused, not bogged down by domestic complications. I made an executive decision. I protected my investment." Lena stared at the woman, a creature of pure, unadulterated ambition. Evelyn hadn't just manipulated Michael with words. She had actively conspired to keep him from his children, hiding the letters, erasing Lena's attempts to bridge the chasm between them. The anger Lena expected to feel was there, but it was overshadowed by a sudden, startling clarity. She had spent 4 years building a narrative in her head with Michael as the sole, monstrous villain. The truth was more complex, and in some ways, more tragic. She walked out of the office without another word and drove straight to the center. Michael was in the yard, helping some of the kids build a lopsided birdhouse. He looked up as she approached, a question in his eyes. "We need to talk," she said. They sat on the same small bench where he had first seen his daughters. "I went to see Evelyn," Lena began, her gaze fixed on the children playing in the distance. She told him everything, about the letters he never received, about the photos he never saw, about the painting she sold, and how Evelyn had known all along. Michael listened, his face paling, his expression shifting from confusion to dawning horror, and finally to a quiet, soul-crushing devastation. The fortress he had built around himself, the careful logic and justifications, crumbled to dust. He had not just been a coward, he had been a fool. A puppet whose strings were pulled by the very person he thought was his greatest champion. He looked at Lena, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. I never knew, he whispered. Lena, I swear to you, I never knew. I know, she said softly. And the most surprising thing was, she did. She looked at this man, covered in sawdust and a little bit of finger paint, and she saw him for the first time in years. Not the monster, not the mogul. Just a man who had made a terrible choice, amplified by the machinations of a woman who saw people as pawns. You were never the villain, Michael, she said, the words feeling heavy and true. The anger had finally dissipated, replaced by a profound, weary sadness for all the years they had lost. But you let people write the story for you. You let them build your life, and you never stopped to read the fine print. Part 5. The Choice. The fine print of his life had come due. The revelation of Evelyn's deception didn't absolve him. It condemned him in a new and more profound way. He had been so blinded by ambition, so desperate for her approval, that he had willingly ceded his own moral compass. The weight of that complicity was heavier than any empire. Just as this new reality was settling in, their fragile, tentative world was rocked again. Lena collapsed at the center one afternoon, overcome by a wave of dizziness and pain. The health issues that had plagued her before her pregnancy, a chronic autoimmune condition, had been dormant for years. The stress and emotional turmoil had triggered a severe flare-up. Her doctors were blunt. She needed rest, a significant reduction in stress, and likely surgery. Suddenly, Michael was no longer a volunteer playing at redemption. He was the only parent available. Lena, weak but resolute, laid out the rules from her hospital bed. You'll stay at my apartment. My mother will be there to help. You will follow the girls' routine to the letter. You listen to them. You pay attention. This isn't about you, Michael. It's about them. He nodded, terrified and determined. I understand. He stepped into the vibrant, chaotic, and loving world Lena had built. It was a world of mismatched socks, glitter glued to the kitchen table, and a calendar crowded with playdates and therapy appointments. It was the antithesis of his sterile penthouse. For the first time, he experienced real fatherhood. The nights were sleepless. Sophia had a nightmare about a monster under her bed, and he found himself sitting on the floor of her room at 3 a.m., whispering assurances until her breathing evened out. The mornings were messy. He learned that Sophia would only eat her oatmeal if it had a smiley face drawn in it with raisins, and that Luna, while she wouldn't eat much, needed her orange juice in a specific blue cup, or she would silently refuse to drink it. He drove them to the center, which now felt like his responsibility too. He sat in on Luna's sessions with her occupational therapist, learning the subtle cues of her silent language. He discovered that her intricate drawings weren't random. They were maps of her emotions. Swirling blues meant calm, while jagged reds meant frustration. He learned to read her better than any stock market report. He was in the middle of a particularly messy art project, an attempt to build a volcano out of papier-mâché that looked more like a brown lump, when he felt a small tug on his sleeve. It was Luna. She was holding up her drawing tablet, on which she had drawn a picture. It was a simple stick figure of a man with wild, dark hair, holding hands with two smaller stick figures. All three were smiling. He felt a lump form in his throat. Later that afternoon, as they were cleaning up, She did something she had never done before. She walked up to him, wrapped her small arms around his legs, and gave him a brief, tight hug before walking away, as if nothing had happened. It was a silent hug, but it spoke volumes. It felt more valuable than the $100 million funding round that had cost him everything. Lena's mother, Maria, watched him with skeptical eyes that slowly softened. One evening, after the girls were asleep, she found him in the kitchen, scrubbing dried paint off the floor. "She did all this by herself, you know," Maria said, her voice quiet. "She built this life for them with her 2 hands and a broken heart. Don't you dare break it again." "I won't," Michael said, meeting her gaze. "I know what I lost. I'm never letting it go again." His old life felt like a distant dream. He ignored the frantic calls and texts from his office. Neuratech, the company that had been his entire identity, was a phantom limb. The only thing that felt real was the weight of Sophia's head on his shoulder as they read a bedtime story, the quiet presence of Luna drawing beside him. But the old life was not done with him. Evelyn Harrington showed up at Lena's apartment unannounced. She looked utterly out of place, a hawk in a canary's cage, her sharp couture a stark contrast to the comfortable, lived-in clutter. "This has gone on long enough, Michael," she said, her voice a low hiss, ignoring Maria, who stood sentinel by the door. "The board is getting nervous. Your little sabbatical is making us look unstable." "This is not a sabbatical, Evelyn. This is my life," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Don't be sentimental. It's unbecoming," she sneered. "I'm here to give you a choice. The Kenjutsu merger is on the table. This is the deal that makes Neuratech a global titan. It makes us legends. But they are a conservative company. They want stability. They want the visionary, not the beleaguered single dad with a charity case attached to him." She placed a thick folder on the kitchen table. "The deal closes at the Hands of Hope Gala tomorrow night. It's a perfect PR opportunity. You will be there. You will announce the merger. You will cut ties with this situation. You will walk back into your life, the one we built, or you can stay here and play house, and I will invoke the key man clause in your contract. I will paint you as an unstable and unreliable leader to the board. I will push you out. The merger will proceed, and Neuratech will be mine. Your choice, your empire, or them." It was the same choice she had given him 4 years ago, cloaked in different terms. Success or family, ambition or love. The old Michael, the boy who craved validation and feared failure, would have taken the deal in a heartbeat. But he was not the old Michael. He had scrubbed floors and cleaned paintbrushes. He had learned the language of silent hugs and raisin-faced oatmeal. He looked at Evelyn, at her cold, calculating eyes, and he felt nothing but pity for her. The next night was the gala. The ballroom was even more opulent than the year before. Michael stood on the stage, the lights hot, the room full of the most powerful people in the city. Evelyn was in the front row, a triumphant smile on her face. She thought she had won. He stepped up to the microphone. "Good evening," he began, his voice clear and strong, echoing through the silent hall. "A year ago, I stood in a room like this, a man who had everything and valued nothing. I was the co-founder of Neuratech, a company I believed was my greatest legacy." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd, finding Lena sitting at a table in the back. She was out of the hospital, looking pale but beautiful, her eyes fixed on him. "I was wrong," he continued. "My legacy is not in a stock portfolio or a global merger. My legacy is in the quiet moments we so often overlook." He looked directly at Evelyn. "I was recently presented with a choice: to secure a massive business deal that would solidify my company's place in the world, or to honor the commitments I failed to make years ago, to choose my empire or to choose my family." A gasp rippled through the room. Evelyn's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of cold fury. "My choice is clear," Michael said, his voice ringing with conviction. "There is no deal in the world worth more than the people I left behind. There is no success worth the cost of your soul. Tonight, I am not here to announce a merger. I am here to announce my resignation from Neuratech." He let the words hang in the stunned silence. "And I am also here to make a promise. The Hands of Hope Foundation will not close its doors. It will have a new home, a new building with all the resources it needs to continue its incredible work, funded in perpetuity." He didn't need Neuratech's money for that. He still had his own. He looked back at Evelyn. He saw the truth in her eyes now. She had never believed in him, only in what he could build for her. This was her plan all along, to use him to build the company, and then to oust him when he was no longer convenient. She thought she was taking his empire. He knew the truth. He was walking away with his dignity, his honor, and the only thing that had ever truly mattered. He had lost his company, but he had found himself. Part 6. The Healing. The months that followed were a quiet, deliberate reconstruction. The tabloid headlines exploded with news of Michael Cavendish's spectacular fall from grace. "Tech Titan implodes," they screamed. "Billionaire walks away from empire." He ignored it all. His world had shrunk to the size of a small apartment in Queens, and for the first time, it felt big enough. Lena recovered slowly but steadily from her surgery. Michael was a constant presence, not as a desperate man seeking forgiveness, but as a partner. He learned to braid Sophia's unruly hair, a task that required the concentration of a bomb disposal expert. He sat with Luna for hours, the two of them filling sketchbooks with their silent conversations. He cooked, he cleaned, he was simply present. The Hands of Hope Foundation, true to his word, thrived. A new building was purchased and renovated, a bright, airy space with state-of-the-art equipment and a sunny outdoor playground. The funding came from a newly established trust, its sole benefactor listed as Emma Rivera, a quiet tribute to the woman who had started it all with a single, selfless act. Michael, stripped of his corporate identity, found a new purpose. He poured his energy and a significant portion of his remaining fortune into launching a new tech initiative. It wasn't flashy or designed to disrupt markets. It was a small company focused on creating affordable, intuitive communication tools and therapy apps for children with autism and other developmental disorders. He named it Lunatech. His work was no longer about changing the world. It was about changing a world, for one child at a time. He and Lena did not fall back into a whirlwind romance. Trust, once shattered so completely, could not be glued back together into a seamless whole. Instead, they built something new. It was a partnership, founded on shared love for their daughters and a hard-won mutual respect. There were days of quiet understanding and days of tense negotiation over parenting styles. It was real, messy, and more profound than the fairy tale love he had once thought he wanted. He didn't live with them, but his small apartment was only a few blocks away, and most evenings he was there for dinner and bedtime stories. The day the twins started kindergarten was a crisp autumn morning. Lena stood on one side of them, Michael on the other. They were a portrait of a modern family, forged in fire and rebuilt from the ashes. Sophia, bubbling with excitement, ran ahead to join the other kids. Luna hesitated, her small hand clutching Michael's. He knelt down, his eyes level with hers. "It's okay, sweetie," he whispered. "It's a new place. Lots of new colors to draw." She looked from the school doors to her mother, then back to him. Her brow was furrowed with an emotion he couldn't quite decipher. Lena knelt beside him, taking Luna's other hand. "We'll be right here when you get out," she said softly. Luna looked at them both, her two anchors in a swirling sea of newness. Then she let go of their hands and took a tentative step towards the school. The healing culminated not in a grand gesture, but in a small, quiet moment. A few weeks later, the New Hands of Hope Center was hosting its first community event, a small exhibit showcasing the children's artwork. Michael's family was there, his parents having flown in, their faces etched with a mixture of confusion and pride at their son's new life. Lena's family was there, a boisterous, loving crowd that had slowly, cautiously, begun to accept him back into the fold. The gallery was filled with the vibrant, chaotic beauty of children's art. In a place of honor was a joint exhibit by Sophia and Luna. Sophia's side was a riot of color, depicting princesses and dragons and a smiling family under a rainbow. Luna's side was a series of panels, all in her signature shades of blue. They were intricate, beautiful, and deeply personal. Michael was standing in front of Luna's panels, trying to decipher the story they told, when he felt the familiar, small tug on his pants. He looked down. Luna was standing beside him, looking up not at the art, but at his face. Her own crystalline blue eyes were searching his. She pointed a small finger at the central panel, a drawing of a man, a woman, and two small girls under a sprawling, protective tree, a clear echo of the one Lena had painted in their nursery all those years ago. He smiled at her. "It's beautiful, Luna Bug. It's my favorite one." She looked at him, her expression serious, her lips slightly parted, as if gathering the courage to do something monumental. The world seemed to fade away. It was just the two of them, standing in a sea of color. Then, for the first time in her 5 years of life, Luna spoke. Her voice was a small, hesitant whisper, a sound as miraculous as the first sunrise. "Daddy." The single word struck him with the force of a thunderbolt. It was a key turning in a lock he didn't even know existed. It wasn't just a name, it was an anointing. It was acceptance. It was forgiveness. It was everything he had thrown away and had somehow, impossibly, been given back. Tears streamed down Michael's face as he knelt and pulled his silent daughter into a hug. Lena watched from across the room, her own tears falling freely, a smile of pure, unadulterated joy on her face. This wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was something far more precious. It was a beginning. In a world obsessed with ambition, Michael Cavendish learned the hard way that success means nothing without someone to share it with. Lena, bruised but never broken, showed us that true strength lies in choosing love without losing yourself. Their journey, marked by betrayal, loss, and redemption, reminds us that it's never too late to rewrite your story. Every heartbreak holds a lesson. Every goodbye can become a new beginning. If this story moved you, touched you, or made you believe in second chances again, please like, comment with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe. There are more powerful, real-life inspired stories coming your way. Until then, choose authenticity, fight for what matters, and never underestimate the power of a quiet voice saying, "I forgive you."